There we go. Hello and welcome everyone to yet another session. Last time we talked about the labor movement in the U.S. and how it kind of arose through the late 19th century, came to fruition during the Great Depression, and petered out throughout the rest of the 20th century. Um, but it also instilled a a um, a new form of protest. It began as being quite violent, um, and hold on, my computer is beeping at me incessantly. Um, there you go. The uh, the um, it started off pretty violently, um, and then turned into a form of peaceful protest, which remains today and became the foundation of much to come. But, um, as I mentioned at the end of class, there was something that peaceful protest would need to be focused upon, and that arose in the South and much of the North as well, um, through Jim Crow, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Um, so hold on a second while I hit the share screen. There we go. Um, need my notes. And there we go. So, remember where we left off with Reconstruction and how Reconstruction um kind of and ended with a bit of a whimper. Um so even though there was an attempt to instill civil rights through a great deal of civil rights legislation, enforcement acts, the deployment of the military specifically to end groups like the KKK, um, white supremacy arose again, anyways. And so um, today we're going to be looking at how it came back. And this was through what were called the Redeemer Democrats. Um, and hence why the subtitle of this is Redemption, because what they what Redeemer Democrats considered themselves to be redeeming was the South back to its glory days prior to the the Civil War, the antebellum South. Um, so this was an attempt to revive it. And remember how we talked about the black codes and that, and you actually read the black codes for Mississippi, uh, and how that started a whole movement from northern politicians and that. Well, with the end of Reconstruction, the North is no longer concerned about the well-being of all those newly freed slaves. So after 1877, Redeemer Democrats took more and more power. And what they were trying to redeem it from is what they called Negro power or Negro rule. And as you can see here, this is actually from a picture from 1898, um, where in North Carolina there was actually um, the last pocket of um, black people actually managing to stay on the ballot through what was called a fusion ballot, um, which was basically um, non-redeemer Democrats who were white but had had a feeling, had sympathy for black people in Wilmington, North Carolina, and um and the Republican black people. And so that fusion was an attempt to actually keep it. Well, the only coup d'etat in history followed this particular in the only successful coup d'etat in American history followed this particular comic. So um this was scaremongering about how Negro rule would suppress white people. Um and it has this long and bigoted history of this fear of black people rising up and destroying the white people because of what they had done. Um, and so this supposed retribution never came. Instead, a group of about 5,000 white supremacists attacked the town hall and killed anywhere between 60 and 120 black people in order to keep them from actually taking their place as the new town council. So this was a actual coup d'etat that happened, and it was based purely out of this kind of fear. And we will see throughout the rest of this that this fear of Negro rule um, was particularly was used to by Redeemer Democrats to continue to gain more power in the South and create the solid South. So with the end of Reconstruction, um, these Redeemers were able to start pushing out elements, political elements such as what they called carpetbaggers and scalawags. So a carpetbagger was somebody who came from the north, supposedly with a bunch of money in a carpet bag, hence the name, um, to take advantage of the South's um, uh, economically ravaged position. Um, they basically would call anyone coming from the north a carpetbagger. And a scalawag was anybody who had defected from um, the Democrats to Republicans. So basically betrayed the South. Um, so you have, for instance, that fusionist party that we were just talking about was a combination of um, this fear of Negro rule and scalawags. Um, and obviously this is all about trying to create a solid South. So you can see here on this comic, it very clearly says the solid South, and you see this black person who's basically forced to put a Democratic ticket into. That's how people voted right there. Is it would be a glass ball, and you'd put your ballot in the glass ball, and so it couldn't be counted without having to break the glass ball. That's how they kept security. But um, you can also see that the Republican Party is dead. This is from 1877, um, just after Reconstruction was done. Um, so from 1876 onward, um, generally the South voted as a singular block for the Democrats. Um, it was exceedingly rare to see Republicans have a foothold in the South, and that's why it was called the Solid South, because it voted solidly Democrat. Um, and so this a lot of black people saw the writing on the wall, and so they started migrating to Kansas, and a huge migration into Kansas in 1877, known as the Exodusters. Um, and it was one of the first of many great migrations that were to come because of the rise of Jim Crow. Um, and about 40,000 exodusters migrated to Kansas. Um, but we'll see later on that this great migration actually comes to be a huge thing in the early 20th century. But this is just an inkling of what is to come. Um, in order to facilitate the rise of Redeemer Democrats, groups like the White League, um, which you can guess what their main objective is from that name, and the red shirts in the Carolinas, well, also in Mississippi, um, were these white supremacist organizations that kind of took over for the KKK. Um, but unlike the KKK, they were less overt about their political violence. Um, so these terrorists were essentially trying to terrorize black people away from voting. Um, either that or forcing them to vote Democrat. They'd also use they would use tactics like ballot stuffing. For instance, there were several counties in North and South Carolina in 1876 that had far more voters than that had far more votes than there were voters. Um, and there were instances where these glass balls that you see here were found in rivers and whatnot, specifically coming from majority black counties and stuff like that. So there was a concentrated effort to rig that election, um, and they were fairly good at it. So once the Redeemer Democrats were able to get a foothold, there kind of became a split in the party between what were known as Bourbon Democrats and Redeemer Democrats. Bourbon Democrats focused on a more positive. Basically, they focused on being the opposition party because remember, Republicans maintained political power throughout this period. So Bourbon Democrats would propose anti-corruption legislation and try to limit foreign affairs. Because by the 1890s, the U.S. became fairly pro-imperialism, and we'll get to that in a later lecture. So they were opposed to this kind of stuff. So, as I said, the Bourbon Democrats functioned basically as the opposition party. So for instance, the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Government Service Act, the one that Garfield died for. Even though Garfield was a Republican, the actual legislation was proposed by a Bourbon Democrat. But don't let that fool you into thinking that these Democrats were not inherently pro Jim Crow. This was just at the national scale. A lot of these folks came from the South and were kind of redeemers as well. And so they tried to raise what they thought was the glory of the South. And even today, we still will hear this supposed glory of the South uttered as what is known as the lost cause myth. We talked a little bit about this in the Reconstruction thing, but this is where it gets particularly insidious. The lost cause is the memorialization of the Confederacy. So these are the people who think that like slavery was good for the slave, that the South had seceded not because of slavery, but because it wanted freedom. and um, that it was a war of northern aggression, and finally that Reconstruction was meant to punish the South. All of these things are false, but this myth arose as people started to eulogize what had happened throughout the 1870s and 1880s. Um, and this became a key part of what Redeemer Democrats wanted to revive. They wanted black people to remain in a patrilineal in a patronizing there we go in a patronizing setting, as in that white people remain supreme, hence white supremacy, um, and black people remain subservient. Um, and that's that whole part where slavery was good for the slave. Um, was that whole idea was to feed into the Redeemer Democrats um, move towards Jim Crow. And so they started instituting policies to really suppress black people, trying to by declaring this lost cause of the Confederacy. They were also making concrete policy proposals, and these proposals really began with black disenfranchisement, as in trying to make black people less likely to vote. Um, so throughout the 1870s and 1880s, um, there were those white supremacist terrorists trying to disenfranchise people by basically committing violence to stop them from voting. But that went from what's called de facto, as in not actually part of the law, but implicitly allowed by government officials, to de jure, as in by law. Um, so that it required a great deal of violence to get to de jure disenfranchisement, and that was the transition from de facto to de jure. And so one of the key things that they would use is various limitations on voter registration, and high requirements for entering the polls in the first place. So, for instance, there was a poll tax. Obviously, people who are coming from slavery, our former slaves, are not as rich as the former masters. Um, and so by instituting a poll tax, as in you have to pay a certain amount of money to even vote, um, that poll tax would eliminate a lot of people who couldn't pay for it. They would also institute literacy tests. Basically, you had to prove that you could read and write. But as this comic kind of shows, this was not equally enforced. It's showing a white Southerner who's, it's saying like education qualifications, and making fun of the fact that like this white man cannot spell or write, but he's Mr. Solid South. And you see this black man kind of off in the corner, forced away from it. So these literacy tests were very much trying to eliminate black people from voting, but somehow had to keep white people still voting, even if they were illiterate. And so a lot of these things had what are called grandfather clauses. So a grandfather clause basically says if you were registered to vote if your grandfather was registered to vote, then you don't have to do these things. And well, there's no racial terminology in a grandfather clause when when the vast majority of the black population was enslaved. Their grandfathers obviously didn't register to vote. They were not allowed to. So these grandfather clauses were basically trying to exempt only white people. And then the other way of limiting registration was registration by referral. And so what registration by referral means is that you can only register if somebody who is already registered has referred you. And you can see how that will also disenfranchise black people. Georgia is the first to institute a poll tax in 1877, literally the same year as the end of Reconstruction. So you already see this disenfranchisement going, but it takes a while. It takes a while for this stuff to build. Most southern states don't institute this kind of stuff until either the late 1880s or mid 1890s. So really, Jim Crow doesn't become a thing until the 1890s, but you could see how it took time to build. So another way of doing this was to basically rig the court system in white people's favor. And by making it illegal for black people to serve on a jury, they could no longer sue about unequal enforcement of literacy tests and things like that, because they were barred from being on a jury, and an all-white jury is less likely to favor a black man. And so Mississippi is the first one to do this in 1884. So once again, you can see how a lot of these things kind of take time to build. The Supreme Court also did its job in trying to institute Jim Crow by invalidating all the civil rights legislation that had come during Reconstruction. In 1883, they virtually eliminated the 14th Amendment by proclaiming that it was unenforceable, and that any legislation that was enforcing it, as in all that enforcement legislation from Reconstruction, was now null and void and unconstitutional. So the thing that was holding back a lot of the South from instituting all this disenfranchisement was virtually eliminated in 1883, and the Supreme Court doubled down with the Plessy v. Ferguson decision, and this was about segregation. That they basically said that it started because there were separate places to sit on a train, and Plessy sued about it. By the way, if you go and look at Plessy's, if you go and look at a picture of Plessy, you will find that he looks pretty much white. So a lot of this, started trying to define the racial line, and so that decision said that that it was perfectly okay to keep black people and white people separate by law, so long as that separation was supposedly equal. That's where we get the term separate but equal. I believe you guys will actually be reading Plessy v. Ferguson, if I remember correctly. So this this, you can see this creeping thing. You eliminate people's vote, then you start trying to segregate them. And once you have black people fully disenfranchised, they basically have no say in how they are governed. And this was solidified in state constitutions. So throughout the 1890s and early 20th century, a lot of states created new constitutions for themselves, um, enshrining that this disenfranchisement in the actual constitution. Mississippi was the first one to do this in 1890, and interestingly enough, you guys might remember that Mississippi just recently changed their flag, um, but that flag that they used to have with the Confederate Jack was also adopted as part of this new constitution. So that old flag was very much a symbol um, of segregation, of Jim Crow. Um, but the way that they could justify these things is to constantly refer to states' rights, that it was a state's right to govern how people vote within it. And that's actually true. Like it is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution that a state governs its own elections. Um, but also, there's the 15th Amendment, which, if the Supreme Court was willing to actually enforce the 15th Amendment, all of these laws would have been unconstitutional. But the Supreme Court sided with the states' rights argument in the civil rights cases and Plessy v. Ferguson and numerous other cases beyond that. So a lot of the time, and yeah, Chase, it is weird hearing Democrats being the Southern party, but we will talk about the party switch in a much later class. Because that really didn't begin until the 1930s and didn't complete itself until the 1990s. So some of you might be capable of remembering when Southern Democrats were still a thing. Anyways, the states' rights argument was basically to say to allow states to disenfranchise the black vote and thereby eliminating the Republican Party from the South altogether. And this was quite effective. For 50 years, the South was solidly Democrat. And with this disenfranchisement, they started to institute segregation. So segregation is not merely, that there's one thing, this typical picture that you see all the time of, white and colored drinking fountains that they don't even want to they don't want to even touch each other, even though hilariously there is a singular pipe between the two. But it's really telling about the entire ethic of segregation. It is to keep the races completely separate. Hold on a second. So, one of the first parts of this that we saw of this growing system of Jim Crow was sharecropping. And basically what sharecropping is that somebody who is a farmer but can't pay for their debt and everything promises a particular share of their crop for the following season. And while that sounds like just, race neutral, it's just a way of paying for things. Once again, realize these are people who are fresh out of slavery and don't really have any means to pay for anything. So sharecropping was, while it actually predates the end of Reconstruction, and actually predates the Civil War, it took on a particularly racialized subclass by basically forcing people to to pay for their entire lives by becoming basically debt peonage. Um, Now, the odd thing about the sharecropping system, though, was that since it was technically race neutral, um, a lot of poor whites ended up getting into this system. Uh, but the vast majority of people who were sharecroppers were black. Um, then Southerners started to segregate schooling. This had actually been a a major thing in the North for a very long time. And in fact, much of the segregated schooling laws came from California, of all places, um, where California had segregated public schools as soon as they started creating them in the 1860s. And this became kind of the model legislation that that the South used to institute Jim Crow. Um, and so black people would go to one school, white people would go to the other. And can you guess where most of the funding went? Um, Even in this picture, which is highly symbolic, you can tell, the colored drinking fountain is far worse than the white drinking fountain. So despite the Supreme Court believing in the whole separate but equal thing, when it played out in actuality, that equality bit never really showed up. Then a lot of the South started regulating whether or not people could be, where black people could even move about. So public spaces would have these kinds of segregated utilities that you would literally have a black part of a park and a white part of the park, and realize this is not purely from the South. Yet again, this is something that was common in the North prior to the rise of Jim Crow. And yet again, the South was basically just copying what the North had already done. But this gets particularly bad when we start talking about vagrancy. So the basic idea of vagrancy is that, you're caught jobless or homeless out in the streets. And so the state can arrest you for being a vagrant. And of course, these laws were technically race neutral. They were colorblind, but that's the thing about color being supposedly colorblind laws, is that they tend to try to erase color, but only cover it up. And so with so many black people being arrested for vagrancy, a lot of states instituted what is called convict leasing. Yet again, this was actually something that predates the United States altogether, but convict leasing took on a particularly malicious aspect when you combine it with these vagrancy laws. So you get arrested for not working, and then you are leased as a convict to work for, a plantation or something along those lines. This is essentially trying to create a new form of free labor. So the prison would pay for itself by having the labor of these convicts leased out, and at incredibly cheap prices for their labor, and the convicts would not get paid for their labor whatsoever. But so all that money was just going straight to the prison, reinforcing the system, and creating a kind of feedback loop. You're too poor to get a job because the jobs are all taken by this convict leasing program. So you become a vagrant because you can't get work, and then you get put right into that system. Um, and while technically it was colorblind, you can see when people are fresh from slavery and have no assets, they are going to be disproportionately affected by these laws. And Redeemer Democrats were pretty blatant about why they were doing this. Another way of maintaining that racial line was to create anti-miscegenation laws. So miscegenation is when is people from differing races having sex with each other, or being married, or living with each other in any way. So anti-miscegenation laws is to make that illegal. So you can, can't be married if you you can, a black woman can't marry a white man, and so on and so forth. And they really made a hard line, not just in terms of the spaces where people of color could even be, but whether or not they can literally live with each other. And that's called a cohabitation law. Cohabitation laws were, once again, something that was actually pretty common in the North. Save for, interestingly enough, a lot of the slave states from the North that got rid of slavery later on. But places like Massachusetts, where they got rid of it pretty quickly, I think in 1784, they had these cohabitation laws. So it's creating once you can create all of these laws, it creates a particular society, which, disenfranchise the vote. You turn that disenfranchisement from purely just being enforced by terrorism to actual law de jure. But then de jure slips back into de facto. As that society is created, people want to enforce that color line beyond the law. And so throughout the 1890s and early 20th century, well into the 1930s, lynching became extremely common. And this was almost always used against Black men who were seen as violating that separation between the races. The lynching was basically to keep the Black population in fear of crossing that line. So you would have people literally getting lynched because they supposedly had whistled at a white woman. A lot of this is also inherently sexist, because there was this fear of Black men violating white women, and so a lot of this was on behalf of white women. So because part of this is creating that myth, that lost cause myth, that Black people were trying to use their Negro rule to violate white women. And another way that this slipped into de facto rules was in housing, when where neighborhoods would literally sign covenants that they would not allow Black people to live there. And so you had basically segregated housing, even though it wasn't by law. No, we will get to how that de facto system was reinforced by federal laws during the New Deal. So you can see there's this constant slippage between the law and how society does stuff outside the law, and back and forth. Um, so by by the 1890s, this whole idea of the lost cause, this eulogization, eulogizing, I mean, of the Confederacy to kind of prop up this idea of what the segregation was for, um, basically reigned supreme. It started um, it's it started in the 1870s, gained currency in the South throughout the 1890s, but in the early 20th century, it started spreading to the North. Um, you had a great effort by the South to kind of redeem itself in the nation's eyes, by saying that this social separation was for the good of the Negro and stuff along those lines, but also to try to teach the lost cause that slavery was good for the slave, the war wasn't about slavery, that it was a war of northern aggression, and that Reconstruction was to punish the South. And so groups started erecting statues to honor to honor the heroes of the South, thereby reinforcing the lost cause. And groups like the United Daughters of the Confederacy took that public display of honoring the fallen heroes of the South to to trying to enforce it through schooling by changing school curriculums to actually teach the lost cause. So the UDC, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, sponsored statues and curriculum. And while it started in the South, it spread to the North, especially through President Woodrow Wilson. During his presidency is known as the nadir of American race relations, essentially the worst time for American race relations. Wilson was a historian by training. He actually had been the president of Princeton before becoming governor of New Jersey and then president of the United States. He was the first Southerner to be president since 1854 with Zachary Taylor. And the Wilson, while being a historian and everything, today would be a terrible historian, but at the time he was rather praised, hence why he was the president of Princeton, a rather prestigious university. And he had written his own people's history, the history of the American people. And part of what made the lost cause so useful by these folks was that it became accepted in academia, especially through the efforts of Woodrow Wilson. And the so when Wilson came to power, he had a vested interest in continuing this lost cause narrative because it reinforced the reason for segregation. You can see it's this feedback loop of de facto to de jure to de facto, and back and forth. And so he legitimated the lost cause, especially by becoming a historian in Princeton. But once he became president in 1913, he basically immediately set about segregating the federal government. The federal government, especially like especially post offices, were kind of a safe haven for Black people to find work, especially once there's all this segregation. It's really difficult to find work, and once it was implemented into the federal government, that's just one more nail in the coffin. Um, and in 1914, he dedicated a Confederate statue at Arlington Cemetery. So you can see he's already really pushing this lost cause narrative right from the beginning of his presidency. But this kind of all came to a head with the publication of this movie, The Birth of a Nation. Now, depending on how you calculate for inflation, it's possible that the Birth of a Nation was and still is the most successful Hollywood movie. And if you could tell, it reinvigorated this idea of the Confederacy. So the basic plot of The Birth of a Nation is that the war was fought for honorable means, and then the Reconstruction unleashes Negro rule and starts trying to suppress white people and violate white women. And so the KKK arose to defeat Negro rule. And so it's this instead of saying that, these guys are terrorists, they're instead saying like they're freedom fighters, trying to stop this evil Negro rule that is violating white women. And so this was the first blockbuster in Hollywood history. It was extraordinarily popular and did the most to popularize the Lost Cause nationally. Lost Cause ideology was taught nationally for the next 50 years. And so in 1915, as all of this thing is gaining popularity, Woodrow Wilson himself actually plays the movie for the first time ever, plays a movie inside the White House, and it was this movie. The movie also quotes Wilson. For instance, here is a actual quote from Woodrow Wilson, quoted in the movie itself, and where he says, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at least there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South, to protect the Southern country." You see how all of this kind of feeds into itself, and allows the federal government to participate in this Jim Crow. So Jim Crow was now nationalized by this Lost Cause myth. And since the movie was doing so well and popularized the Klan, remember the Klan had been eliminated in the 1870s and did not exist prior to 1915, a second Klan arose as kind of a fraternal organization. And this fraternity, while starting in 1915, didn't really reach its zenith until 1925, 22, somewhere around there, till the second Klan kind of blew up itself because a bunch of accounting scandals in the late 1920s. But Woodrow Wilson was dead by that point, so we're not talking about that right now. So the Klan arose. For instance, this whole idea of cross burning came from the movie. That had nothing to do with the original Klan. The Klan did not burn crosses. But because the movie showed this particular image so much, it literally shows people galloping around with burning crosses throughout the movie, that became a symbol of this second Klan. And by the end of Wilson's presidency in 1919, there was Red Summer, where a series of race riots, or probably better termed race massacres, took place throughout the U.S. reinforcing this new terrorization, and this federal Jim Crow, along with this lost cause narrative that had spread throughout the entire nation. Um, Groups like that, newly formed groups like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, um, tried to reach out to Wilson, thinking that his lofty rhetoric of self-determination and whatnot was somehow sincere, that he would actually try to reverse all of this stuff. But Wilson very audaciously said that this segregation was good for the Negro, that you know that this paternalism that is being put upon um, Black people was for their own good. Um, so this this of course instills a need to fight this. Um, the first attempts to try to stop some of this legislation begin um, with the 1875 Civil Rights Act. But as we saw earlier, the Supreme Court struck that down in 1883. So activists started to arise, groups like the NAACP. So until the late 19th and early 20th century, lynching it wasn't actually considered like a racial thing. It was considered a more of a vigilante thing, that vigilantes lynched people because the law couldn't bring these people to justice or something along those lines. Remember, we've talked about lynching in the West, and that's where that idea comes from. But this lady named Ida B. Wells started pushing to change that perception that Black people were disproportionately lynched, especially in the South, as this Jim Crow began to be instituted. So she would actually go on tours around Europe to try to raise awareness, and worked with the Chicago Tribune to start counting the lynchings. This is a picture from the office of the Chicago Tribune, and they would literally, every time somebody was lynched, the following day they would put out a flag saying, put out this flag to raise awareness as to this problem. Before Wells, there was Frederick Douglass, a venerable abolitionist from before the Civil War, who continued to advocate for Black people to not be treated this way. But as he grew old, people began to not pay attention to his movement. So it became the realm of new individuals such as Booker T. Washington, who believed that that the Black man had to elevate himself out of this segregation. That in order to achieve equality, they had Black people had to prove that they were equal. And so he created a lot of educational institutions such as the Tuskegee Institute. And then there was intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois. And W.E.B. Du Bois writes a great deal about like the philosophy of this segregation, of what it truly means to be Black, this dual identity of supposedly being a proper American while being forced to be subservient to white Americans. And then you have people following Du Bois like Anna J. Cooper, who basically creates a protoform of what we would today call Black feminism. And remember how we've talked about how the racial line was also pretty sexist. She theorized how that was. Groups like the NAACP came about in 1904. And so you can see that there's a real movement growing in the early 20th century to stop Jim Crow. But it wouldn't be until the 1950s and 60s where that movement saw great successes. In the meantime, people tried to get away from the South. And so the Great Migration, as it's known, began in the 19 teens. They were essentially trying to escape segregation, and so northern cities such as Chicago, pictured here, created their own segregation instead. So for instance, there was in 1919 during Red Summer, with all those race massacres happening, the most prominent one of them all was because some kids crossed a line, a literal line in the sand, at the beach there in Chicago, the beach on Lake Michigan, and a white man came out and beat these kids senseless and threw rocks at them. And instead of arresting him, the police showed up and arrested some black people who were yelling about arresting the man who had just beaten up a bunch of kids. And so this turned into a huge riot and spread throughout the city. White supremacists used this to firebomb people's houses and that kind of thing, leaving around 25 to 50 people dead. So there was a strong reaction against this huge migration. And part of the reason why Chicago was so affected was that there was a strong rail network throughout the entire US, and the hub of it was Chicago. So as people sought a place to go, they took the rails to Chicago and ended up settling there. So these race riots or race massacres really informed how the North would basically become complicit in Jim Crow as well. So with all of that being said, let's jump out of screen sharing. Hold on a second. There we go. We can see that this is a system, right? This isn't just like a group of individual laws or anything along those lines. But it also isn't something that like, it's not like the people instituting Jim Crow were, had like some insidious plan to create this entire system from the get-go. It grew over time. And so what was the fundamental driving force behind all of this? Anybody? Do I have, hold on a second, do I have the, no.
The fundamental driving force the fundamental driving force of Jim Crow laws, is that what you're asking?
Yes. So was it because of just pure racism? Was there something behind this racism? Was white supremacy ulterior purposes? Was it the lost cause that pushed all of this? What do you guys think? Margaret says, I have always felt like it was almost revenge / retribution for their rights to slavery being taken away. And yeah, you can definitely make that argument, can't you? There's the idea that that whole idea that Negro rule was um, purely was purely a way of punishing the South for rebelling, and that. But at the same time, then why does it move to the federal level? And I think Chase just said something about that. Hold on a second. Chase says the segregation moving onto federal law, which probably gave them more confidence in being more aggressive. What do you mean by being more aggressive? It's probably taking a while to. You can just unmute and say it. With their violence and general hatred toward colored people. Well, yeah, I mean, racism is certainly a driving factor of all this, right? But when we're talking about historical systems, especially historical systems that involve a great deal of violence, it's not purely just hatred. That hatred has a cause.
Control.
Control. That's a great one-word answer. But elaborate a little bit. Why is control driving white supremacy?
Well, I mean, like if we're going to talk specific examples, I mean, the idea of convict releasing, I think that really plays or is, a very good depiction of that, just because they're profiting, as far as like cheap or even free labor just off the backs of people that have nothing. And then being convicts, they have even less resources available to them in society. So,
well, it's
basically like
so it's like
keeping
they're. Oh, go ahead.
It was just basically like trying to keep whites in their place of power, I guess. Just reinforcing that they are the supreme race.
But that comes with benefits, right? And as you're saying, things like convict leasing really show kind of the dark side of this racism. That it's not purely because they hate Black people; it's because they benefit from hating Black people. That there is an economic reason for being racist, and by disenfranchising them, by creating these vagrancy laws and convict leasing, but also by having a subservient labor force, they can basically create an underclass, and that underclass is forced to work, either not paid or paid extremely low wages, and expected to remain subservient within society. So it's a system that reinforces itself, and benefits the people in power. I want you guys to especially think about that kind of thing when it comes to when we're talking about violence in American history and whatnot, that it's not just what it seems to be on the surface. There is a deeper reason for all of this. And that's what what you can talk about on the test when, say you see something like Jim Crow on the test. You can not only say that, it instituted segregation, disenfranchisement, and whatnot, but you can also talk about why, and that why is the significance. And so you could say to have a subservient labor force. And well, that is kind of what slavery was in the first place, right? While convict leasing is not slavery, because slavery requires ownership. The prison system does not own you if you are leased by a prison. The it is kind of trying to recreate that system of slavery, where you had a subservient labor force. But also think about lower class white men here, because remember we've talked a little bit throughout the lecture about how that a lot of these laws ended up, because of their colorblind nature. They're not, most of them are not written specific, saying that it's specifically targeting Black people, even though it is absolutely doing that. But by accident, things like sharecropping, vagrancy laws, and that kind of stuff end up getting applied to lower class white men. So why wasn't there more solidarity between those people who were still being affected by these laws, but not, but somehow they weren't opposed to those laws? Why is that?
I would say it's probably because of the financial, what would you call them? The financial classes that they were in.
Okay.
I mean, it's always been that way. There's always been kings and there's always been serfs. There's always been royalty, and everybody else works the land. So I would say the way that the underclass or lower class was treated was just because they did not have that money. If they did have that money, the money would speak for them in a different way. There's always been acceptance of wealth throughout history.
But how does that apply to lower class white men not fighting this Jim Crow? Why did lower class white men not see themselves in solidarity with underclass Black people?
Because they were white, and there was a white supremacy stigma since the beginning of the United States. It showed that if you were of European descent, you were somehow better than those that you were bringing to this country or those that were already in this country. I wasn't there to say it, but that's the way it's been shown to me throughout my history classes and the way I've learned it.
So it was kind of a way of showing that this underclass made it so that a lower class may be forgotten, right? Basically, the attitude of hold on a second. The attitude of at least I'm not that, right? That attitude of like, I'm in a bad situation, I can't pay my mortgage, I have to sharecrop to even exist in that, but at least I'm not Black, right? It is this way of showing that there is somebody worse off than you. And to quote the person who actually who actually signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law, Lyndon Baines Johnson, if you can teach a white man that a black man is worse, you will forever hold him under your thumb. So the system of white supremacy also ends up hurting white people, right? Especially lower class white people. But it helps maintain the power of elites by making sure that these lower class white people cannot see themselves in solidarity with those who are segregated from them. So remember how we've talked about the labor movement on Tuesday. You can see how the labor movement kind of reinforces this, that it's that the instead of forming class solidarity with segregated black people, they instead focus on trade unionism and that kind of thing, and do so with great success in the 1930s. But also in the 1930s is kind of the height of lynching. So why isn't the labor movement dealing with that? Part of it is because of this whole difference between lower class and underclass. The "at least I'm not black" attitude. And so I hope you guys can see that there's a lot to this. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about throughout the rest of the class is going to be trying to undo this great injustice of Jim Crow. Because even though Jim Crow has long been eliminated, its economic tendrils remain today. And we still have basically a black underclass. And you can see the outpouring of how this underclass has been mistreated happening last summer throughout the George Floyd protests, and that there's a direct link to all of this, right? One historian has called the current mass imprisonment system the new Jim Crow. So this is a system, and that institutes white supremacy. It's fed by the lost cause as its kind of foundational myth. It's and justified through that myth. Realize that myth provides identity. So when people believe in this, it's not just that they're getting they have this like calculation in their head going like, yes, I need to have an underclass so that I can repress black people and that, and so that's why I'm using this lost cause myth. Instead, it's their identity that's wrapped up in this myth. So it's not some insidious plan. It is ultimately a system, a self-reinforcing system. And trying to undo that will take more time than we have had thus far. So with that being said, I hope you guys have a good weekend. This was obviously not a fun lecture, but I hope you got something out of it. If you want to ask any questions, we'll be here, or my office hours are right after this. Otherwise, I will see you guys on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
You too.
So, Mr. P, I had a question about the Plessy versus Ferguson. It says the opinion to read. Is that just the section before the
Yes.
litigation starts? Okay.
Yeah. So it actually I believe the thing actually says like this is the opinion section. If you go to the website, I believe I'm linking to Cornell there. if I
Yeah.
remember correctly. The
I just want to make sure.
yeah, so it's the opinion section. It says very obviously like opinion, because the opinion of the court is what is what is made what is and isn't constitutional. It's that is the thing that they are ruling. That is their actual ruling.
All right. Well, thank you for the information, sir. You have a good weekend.
You too.